Octopath Traveler 2 has been out for a little over a month now, and despite being nowhere close to finishing it, I've been thoroughly enjoying the experience Octopath 2 provides. The music goes harder than ever before, the sprite work is impeccable, combat is as clean as whatever the opposite of an anime fan is, and finally, the cast is more diverse than ever before. Which, in case you didn't read the title, is the main topic for today's video, and what I'd personally consider Octopath 2's greatest strength. At least when comparing it to its predecessor, if nothing else. Diversity is obviously a very important tool when designing, well, basically anything. By being unique and different, you not only distinguish yourself from the competition, but you also create something completely new in the process. Take, for example, the traditional coming-of-age story. It's a genre that's been done to death to the moon and back, but slap a bunch of supernatural devils and a garbage-eating teenager who just really wants to touch some melons into it, and you have yourself the wildly successful Chainsaw Man. Having something be completely original or just wildly different is the way to be successful, provided your original ideas and execution don't suck ass. So I think it's in its own attempts to distinguish itself that Octopath 2 finds a new major selling point. A game with a boatload of variety. To explain what I mean, look no further than Octopath 1. Yes, Darcy, explain why Octopath 2 is great by analysing Octopath 1 instead. Genius idea. When Octopath 1 came out, it had two things going for it. It being a return to classic SNES-styled RPGs with a sick new HD 2D graphics engine, as well as featuring 8 unique characters with individual stories that it intertwine. But it's mainly the second point that I want to touch upon. 8 characters, 8 stories. That's what pretty much all the story was marketed as. And it was, and still is, a really fun idea. There's a reason having multiple starter Pokemon is a thing. People like choosing their own way to start. It makes where or what you start with feel more personal when you pick it over the others, even if you could still visit these other places or get whatever you didn't pick later on. But when it comes to the original Octopath split narratives, I have just one thing to say. Did they really need to be separate? Like, I get the appeal of having 8 original stories set in the same world with some interaction between them, and I did still quite enjoy each narrative. But everything within them felt very consistent. The tone of each story was very consistent, the characters were consistent, the character designs were consistent, the locations, the scenery, the dialogue, the general plot structure. It was always very consistent. And because of all this consistency, I can't help but wonder if these narratives could have been woven into one giant narrative. After all, if the writing of each story is already similar enough, then why not? Why isn't that Primrose's quest for revenge couldn't work alongside Ulbrich's? The tones and types of stories that were being told didn't vary all that wildly, and when they did, it was regularly still pretty close to a narrative core. So it definitely doesn't seem impossible to merge them all together into one big, hopefully less messy narrative pile. The only problem is that this would obliterate the choice at the start of the game, and henceforth, further obliterate one of the main draw-ins for Octopath Traveler. Like, I get that they're separate from a gameplay standpoint, since you can't realistically know what travelers the player may or may not have at any given moment, so interactions within the party were bound to be minimal, especially during story events. But even that still doesn't completely change how I feel on the topic. I like the cast of Octopath Traveler, I really do, so not seeing them interact all that much just hurts to see. And when I know they could have written it as one big story where the travelers' own stories interact and interconnect with one another, it just feels like smacking salt onto the already very infected wound. No, I am not visualizing that for you. But now, we have the brand new Octopath 2, which surely manages to not disappoint me. Oh wait, no, it still does. but not as much! While Octopath 2 obviously suffers from the same lack of interaction in the main stories of each character, it doesn't hurt nearly as much as before. Like I said earlier, my biggest issue of Octopath 1's split narratives was how consistent everything was. How easy it'd be to write it all into one thing. Octopath 2 manages to alleviate these feelings by being really diverse. Where I couldn't see the reason for Octopath 1 being separate stories, I do for Octopath 2. To explain what I mean, look no further than the types of stories they're telling this time around. A revenge-seeking scholar framed for the murder of his wife and daughter. An apothecary with amnesia searching for their past identity. A frickin' merchant aiming to defeat poverty because he himself lived in poverty after getting scammed by a former business partner. Chef's kiss with that one, that was genius. Further expanding upon this, Oswald's story has this really gritty and almost melancholic tone to it, whilst Partitio's is generally more upbeat. There is so much variety in the stories this time that interlinking them becomes a much harder task to do. And when it would probably be messier as one story, I end up being less disappointed that they're separate again. Like, I kinda get why the rootin' tootin' cowboy merchant isn't in the same narrative as the exiled prince of an Asian-inspired kingdom. Also, did I mention that they are a literal 20-minute walk away from each other? This is not a joke. Consistency be damned. They're talking about trains and the idol industry now. Okay, the last one might not be true, but have you played Agnia's story? Because it basically is. With each story having a lot more variety within it, I am way more open to them being completely separate again. While I obviously still wish it could be one big story, knowing that each narrative is wildly different in pretty much every element makes it bearable. It also definitely helps having such diverse stories to tell as well. In Octopath Traveler 1, I chose Tressa as my starting traveler, since having a merchant as a protagonist of a JRPG was something completely new to me. I'd heard of stories about healers and warriors before, but never a merchant. It was uncharted territory as far as I was concerned. So, coming into Octopath 2, I was planning to make a similar-ish decision, picking the traveler with the most original sounding story. But here's the thing. It wasn't as easy of a decision as I'd thought. Each story had some element that drew me in. Would I pick the story about a scholar being thrown in prison and mugging people? Or maybe the one about a priest doing some detective work? Each one called to me in a way that the original Octopath's cast never could. And I still really liked that cast. It wasn't like I was being pitched one story broken up into chunks, but rather multiple separate stories in one neat package. If that makes sense. So when each option presented to me seemed just as appealing as the next, I can't fault them for being separate. They really knocked it out of the park with this one when making all these stories so unique. Of course, these are just my thoughts on how the narratives have been laid out. Currently, I've only finished Chapter 1 for each character, and a few Chapter 2s as well. So for all I know, they could be completely nosediving in quality later down the line, and the variety would just, disappear. But as it stands now, I'm really enjoying the diversity Octopath 2 has been providing. Also, for you curious folks out there, I picked Casti because you regularly don't see an amnesia plot on a profession as simple as an apothecary. I say simple profession as a guy doing an English degree, so take that as you will. As always, thanks for watching, and remember, eat your vegetables.